to see how. I've never done the bit that this is Mike's bit normally, so I'm not sure how it works. Seems to be working at the moment, so cool. I guess that's working. Okay, looks like it is. Right. So I wanted to just sort of build on some of the things. Oh, hang on, I'm going to listen to myself, which is no good at all. That's it. Otherwise, I'm going to hear myself talking. That's no good. So I thought one of the things I was thinking about this morning, really, with this whole thing around dissonance and consonance, and actually how we bring harmony into the world in which we live. And you know, I've been really struck with over pretty much my whole life, I've been a peacemaker. I've found myself in situations where I've been in between people. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. So when I was growing up in middle school, so I would have been about 7 or 8, there was 2 gangs in my school, and I was in both of them. And the 2 leaders of both gangs were friends of mine, best friends. So I ended up becoming the go-between between 2 gangs, which seems a bit weird, but that's just how it was. When there was a problem within my home church as I was growing up when I was 18, I was on both sides of the argument. I came to university and there was a fallout between the Christian Union and the church I was in. And obviously I was in the Christian Union and the church I was in. And it seems to have gone on like that throughout my whole life. But Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they'll be called children of God." And it's a wonderful thing to be called, isn't it? And to be in harmony with what Jesus wants to do is really, really good. The other thing I had just in mind was the prayer of St. Francis, which is sort of echoed in my life for a while. And then I'm going to read from James chapter 3, verses 13 in a minute. So you might want to look that up if you want. But the prayer of St. Francis, which is probably well known for all of us, the Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek as to be consoled as to console, as to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving we receive, and in pardoning we are pardoned, and it's dying that we're born to eternal life. Prayer of St. Francis, which is obviously lovely. And obviously the world in which we live at the moment, there's a lot of division, isn't there? You know, pretty much every election we're seeing at the moment is 48-52 in terms of percentage breakdowns, which is at one level is helpful because there's an outcome, but another level, you know, that actually 48% of people are unhappy. And I think that's a real challenge for us as Christians in terms of what our role is, in terms of either stoking the fires or actually being peacemakers and maybe making a difference. So I'm just going to read from James chapter 3, where it says this: who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. Sorry, this is from 3:13. But if you harbor bitterness, envy, or selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come from heaven, but it's earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You desire but do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. And when you ask, you do not receive because you're asking with the wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your own pleasures. And it goes on. You adulterous people, you don't know that friendship with the world means enmity with God. Therefore, anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. Or do you think Scripture says without reason that he jealously longs for the Spirit he has caused to dwell in us, but he gives us more grace? God opposes the proud, but shows favor on the humble. Submit yourselves then to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Grieve, mourn, and wail. Change your laughter to mourning, your joy to gloom, and humble yourself before the Lord, and he will lift you up. Which is a bit of a challenge to Christians, isn't it? In terms of our response to the world in which we live. I'm on social media. I guess a number of us are. I am aware of the negativity on social media. And even when you put what you think is a positive comment about something, it can be interpreted wrongly. And I think I've been very conscious the last not 7 months, I guess, or in fact, actually ever since some of the votes that have been 48-52, to be fairly conscious of what I write and to try and be balanced in terms of what I write. But being balanced doesn't necessarily mean we're particularly good at being clear. And I think sometimes that's a challenge. So I'm throwing that out as a sort of starter this evening, and how we bring peace in this world. We can speak specifically about the American election because that's a bit further away from us if you want, or we can speak a bit more local, or we can just talk about it amongst our friends and neighbours and how we sort our quarrels out between ourselves. And the other thing I was obviously conscious of is that even in the Bible, quarrels happen amongst good people. So obviously we read the quarrel between Peter and Paul about John Mark. And I mean, to sum it up, it wasn't Peter, was it? It was Barnabas and Paul about John Mark. And Barnabas was a bit gracious and kind and wanted to give John Mark a second chance. And Paul had had enough of him and decided that actually his chance was done. And they all clearly argued enough about it that they went separate ways, but actually that actually led, as we later read, to cause the spread of the gospel. So there's some good things, but I think sometimes sometimes we have to hold our ground. Sometimes we are peacemakers. I'd just be interested to know, I maybe just want to forget all of what I just said and just talk about this morning's talk. I'm happy either way. So I don't know what you've got, Paul, Dave. I'm going to pick on you two because you're elders. Susie, yeah, anyone actually.
Well,
Jojo,
as a person who you haven't mentioned, I think I've just been reflecting on how why people are more likely to be divided, and I think that in our society today, our identities are quite tribal. So particularly for people whose identity is not in faith, then in our society, you know, you're more likely to identify by perhaps what sort of music you listen to, or which political party you vote for, or which side of the Brexit debate you're on. And I think that by moving to the place where our identity is based on those characteristics, it means that when somebody has a different opinion, there's inevitably going to be tension, because what that is doing is challenging. You know, I think it's fundamentally about identity and about challenging the core of who we are as people.
Sure.
That's why I think we have why there's so much emotion in it, because it matters so much to people. So the challenge is how can we do that differently as Christians? You know, our identity is in Christ, you know, and that's something that isn't going to change over time. A lot of these other issues come and go. That is constant. But we can still be challenged by people of other faiths and of none. But yeah, I think it comes down to issues of identity.
Yeah, where you put your security, basically. Because I think you're right. Because I think it's where we feel secure that it helps us, doesn't it? Yeah.
I think I think it's more than security. I think it's how we understand ourselves, how we perceive ourselves, how we value ourselves, how we define ourselves. And so we're challenging someone's definition of themselves sometimes, or what we're saying that we're different to that. Yeah. So yeah, I think it comes down to some very core beliefs. When we talk about Christianity and, you know, building on the rock, well, if you're not building on the rock of Christianity, you're building on something else. You know, there's not an absence. There are other things there. There are other beliefs. They might not be as kind of risen to the surface, but they're still there.
That's really helpful. Yeah. Paul, Dave, Susie?
I was going to say the same thing, Joe, about people being tribal, and I think it's even sort of evident when, you know, we do have our gangs, we do want to mix with like-minded people, which is sometimes been frustrating, especially when, you know, I've even done things like when I've done my coffee mornings and wanted to mix and match the Christians and non-Christians, and yet people still mix with who they want to mix with, as opposed to, could you mingle? But yeah, it's even in the last week, I overheard two conversations that I so wanted to step in on, and I thought, but I didn't hear the beginning of this conversation. You know, when people have been going on about COVID, and they've all been talking about it. Oh, the rich are looking after themselves, and the poor are poorer, and with the lockdown, it's like, but it's not about that. It's about the health service needing to prevent the deaths. It's not about the money. But I just thought I couldn't quite leap in because I thought I wasn't in the beginning and that I wasn't included in the conversation. But I so wanted to dip in, and other people who were saying things, so where is this? What is this? And I thought, well, in some ways, I'm quite fortunate to be married to Dave and knowing what he's going through, that there is evidence of COVID, because people are now saying it's, especially when the conspiracy theorists or the, you know, the red top newspapers are saying there's no evidence of it. And it's like, but you know, Dave is witnessing it. Dave has lost a colleague to COVID, and it's having that chance to step in at times, but do it in a godly way. But there are still some subjects that it feels difficult to express a calm opinion because of the cancel culture and stuff like that. That if you want to have a Christian opinion about some things, you will get your head shot above the parapet. Even with all, you know, although it's been quite amusing, some of the comments that have come regarding the politics at the moment, I still get uncomfortable about negativity. I mean, even, you know, it's like Spitting Image that's raised its head again, and you know, one of the kids was saying how much they liked watching it. And I said I could not watch it when I was younger. I hated snide humour. I just couldn't watch it. You know, I didn't enjoy that kind of knocking of people, whether they deserve it or not. So yeah, we stick with what we know, don't we? In some ways, and the people we know. I don't know if that's been covered.
Thanks, Susie. Thank you. Yeah, Dave, Paul, have you got anything?
Yeah, it's I certainly go along with the sort of the tribalism aspect of it, and without wanting to rake up old cliches, actually, because we tend to hang out with people who are like-minded, that tends to reinforce the stereotype, particularly in an era of algorithms and social media and the rest of it. Then you tend to hear the views that are more like your own. But that's a bit of a stereotype. I think the biggest challenge is knowing that there are so many issues where, as you say, there is this sort of 52-48 split. It's knowing how to gently be able to cross the bridge, and how to have rational, non-emotive discussions. So yeah, it's, you know, when you are presented with somebody who, for example, not so long back. I won't put the situation in, but it was the people I was speaking to were didn't believe in COVID and thought it was all a huge conspiracy theory, and it was basically an opportunity for Bill Gates to become personally enriched at the expense of everybody in the country, and the vaccine program was there designed to put microchips in you so you could be tracked. And you kind of stop and you go, right, okay, how can you actually say something that's that doesn't perpetuate this, but is because we're not people who particularly like conflict. Let's face it, So you could meet it head on, and you could go, no, that's rubbish. And so it's just having the form of words to take a deep breath and say, stop being ridiculous, but actually still get them to do the job that they're meant to be doing without sabotaging it. So it's
also not belittling people.
Yeah. So the challenge sometimes is when you're faced with something that's blatantly crazy. One of my colleagues was in a taxi, and the taxi driver was equally spouting conspiracy theories about how COVID didn't exist, and she just said, "Look, can you just stop the car, please?" And so he pulled over and said, "What's up?" He said, and she said, I cannot spend any more time in the car with such an idiot," and got out and left the taxi. And so that's kind of a more extreme example where you remove yourself from the situation. So I'd be quite interested to hear from you guys, to hear about how you can be a peacemaker, and you can be a voice of reason without being overly confrontational, or aggressive.
Well, but as you were saying that, of why I was so impressed with how Dave approached this subject of not making these particular guys feel small for their opinions, plus the mean-spiritedness of thinking that these rich people who are giving their hard-earned money for vaccines are doing it for their own ends. And is it Paul, when he was it Athens, of seeing that there was a monument to an unknown god, and yet he doesn't slam into them. He just says, "Oh, I see you're a faithful people." And so he could have done hellfire and brimstone type preaching, but he didn't. He wooed them with getting them on track of, "Oh yes, you have got a faith, let's work on that." And I just thought it's sometimes good to, I suppose, when you talk to people, to make them realise, oh, you are using your brain, but let's think about it this way, So, but Dave was really impressive how he dealt with their arguments of, because you just kind of blink.
Yeah. Go on, Paul. I'll let you speak since you've been quiet so far. Yeah.
I haven't got much to say with it. I think there's a few things. I think being a peacemaker is about serving other people, which, like, you lay your life down. And I agree with what's been said about the tribalism. I think, in the past you've had key people like that have spoken up for movements, or like Martin Luther King, or key people who have spoken for whole movements and change and for the people. But that's changed because of social media, I guess. And so everyone has a voice, which is like a white noise. But then you've got groups, like Joe was saying, tribes. And so I think, and so if somebody speaks from a tribe, they speak on behalf of the whole tribe, not just themselves. So it is a self-worth and a values issue, but you've got these tribes and you've got spokespeople for the tribes. And I think there are groups that do well at that, although I'm not saying that's necessarily positive. Maybe sometimes better than the church, because I think you know, I think sometimes we can leave it to leaders or other ways. And then it's what do we do? See, God, I mean, for me, I was just thinking about this. God, you know, we've not been told to fight our corner or fight the church's corner. Putting it simply, we're told to love God and love people. And I think it's how do we then do that? How do we serve people, and how do we lay down our own opinions and thoughts, while not compromising anything, but drawing people? And then what is it we're drawing people to see? So you've got people that are poles apart. What is our role in that? Is it just to bring peace for the sake of peace? I think for me, it's like a war of words, and in any war, it's quite tricky for the gospel to get out. It makes it a little bit more tricky. Where when it's peace, the gospel abounds, and I think, you know, I think there's obviously the enemy wants to divide and conquer, although he won't do that, but that's what he thinks, but he likes to make it very difficult for people to not hear. You know, he wants to make it easy for people to not hear the gospel, and he wanted to make our voice silent and drowned out in the noise of all the other voices. So it's being creative, and it's the whole church that needs to speak. Each individual, I think, needs to play their part. Rather than just a handful of people thinking they're speaking up, or we looking to the Archbishop of Canterbury or something, and he's speaking for the church, and which I suppose he does in a way, but actually it's for each of us to play our part and to step in the gap for things like justice, you know. So I think for me it's like laying down certain things, isn't it? I mean, we talk about the Beatitudes. That's a good way to start, really, as well. You know, Jesus spoke a lot about that. But I think the challenge for believers is we think we don't have a voice, or we don't have a lot to say, and how can we possibly influence anything? But I think it's not that we're called to make disciples, but we're called to love people, love God, and love people, and look after them and bring justice. And some people will have louder voices. Some people will be in positions of power and influence more than others. But it really is a very divisive sort of thing at the moment, isn't it? I mean, I'm on Twitter. I mean, Twitter is just a nightmare. I mean, honestly, you've got. I mean, even let's just take Christianity and the church. I mean, just in that alone, you've got point scoring and people all over the place, and people poles apart with theology and dogma. And you know, if an unbeliever or an atheist dips into that, it's almost like they're sort of like roasted straight away, and it's not full of grace. It's not trying to win people. It's trying to score points. But that's replicated in all these other tribes. It's all the same. So I think prayer goes a long way, and I think also hearing, for me, I think it's hearing from God and saying, you know, it's breaking it down a little bit and saying, are there one or two people within this tribe that I can connect with that actually are a man and woman of peace themselves, but they've got quite strong opinions, and can I get a connection with them somehow in this neutral way, or this bridge that we can meet in the middle and talk about something that may be nothing to do with where we're both at, in order to find common ground. And I think a lot of common ground has been lost. So for me, it's trying to find common ground. That doesn't mean compromise, although it can look like it sometimes. To a very zealous believer, it can look a little bit like you're compromising. But Paul said he's all things to all men in order to win some for the gospel. And I think that's quite a big lesson in there that we could look at as well. Anyway, these are just some rambling thoughts that I've had. Thanks,
Paul. I mean, I think the other thing I realised just thinking about it, even in the context of cognitive dissonance, which is what I spoke about this morning, is that people are very invested in certain things. So, and to be honest, that was true of me. I was very invested in atheism before I became a Christian. I was very invested in it, and actually it took me a month to tell my parents I'd become a Christian, because the investment I put into being an atheist. That actually to tell them that actually I'd finally given up and actually accepted the fact that they were right and I was wrong was very hard for me to do, even though there was great joy in becoming a Christian. And I think there is that element of which sometimes we just need to give people permission almost to be invested in things that they're invested in, but actually still be truth givers. I mean, I think that's a key, isn't it? And then the challenge is what's truth and what's, and Donald Trump has done a great job at making fake news out of truth. Yeah. And to be honest, some of it has been fake news as well. So I mean, there you go. I'm being balanced as usual. But so sometimes he's right. But there's an investment in that, isn't there? So when I was reading about cognitive dissonance and the fact that people are invested in certain things, that people, because they're so invested in certain ways of doing things, they end up tribalizing or going into groups and finding themselves where they support those messages. So I mean, and that's what the 48-52 sort of finds people, because you're resonating with people around you. In America, it's particularly pertinent that they don't have a BBC, which in theory is supposed to be in the middle of the ground. And actually the evidence is it's more or less that place. They have Fox and CNN, and they're both, two sides of a coin almost, and they have opposing views on the news. So depending on which news channel you watch, you choose your news, and that's sort of exacerbated by the world in which we live, in terms of, if you're just watching your Facebook friends generally agree with you, not all of them, but they generally do. Or you find your news in the place you want to find it. One of the things I read, which I found was really helpful, when they talked about how do you overcome dissonance, how do you overcome people's perceived failings, I suppose would be that'd be a way of putting it. Is an example they gave of Ronald Reagan and Shimon Peres. So Shimon Peres was the leader of Israel, and Ronald Reagan was obviously President of the United States, and they were good friends. And Reagan had done a lot for Israel, and they'd got on reasonably well from a sort of political viewpoint. But Ronald Reagan had a disastrous visit to a cemetery in Germany where the members of the Waffen SAS were buried, and Perez, obviously that wouldn't have been a good thing for him, for Reagan to have done that. And obviously people were trying to stoke the fire between them and actually try and create try and separate the two of them. But Perez said something which was really pertinent to the time, and it actually solved a lot of the issues. He said, when a friend makes a mistake, the friend remains a friend, but the mistake remains a mistake. And there's an element of that which we sort of need to grab hold of, really, that actually people are making mistakes around us all the time, but we still got to love we talk about loving the sinner, but we have to love our friends. We have to love our neighbor as ourselves, recognizing that we also make mistakes. We also make errors of judgment and make choices that are wrong. And I think there's that whole thing around honesty. I mean, that bit I read from James earlier talks about integrity. It talks about being honest. It talks about, things that are attributes of peacemakers, effectively, people look at you and go, well, actually, if I'm actually going to choose between the two people to believe here, I'm going to believe him or her, because actually they've got a track record on being honest. Totally, I will believe them, and I think that's something perhaps as Christians that we could grab hold of. I mean, for the rights and the wrongs of what's going on in America and other places, I think integrity and honesty is a key factor, isn't it? And actually, if you're never proven to be a liar, that's got to be a really good and helpful thing, I think, in the end of the day. And I think as Christians, that's one of the things that and that's probably why we're called children of God. Blessed are the peacemakers, because they'll be called children of God. Because actually, in the end, we're portraying something that's godly, isn't it? And different. So if we're in an office argument and we don't take sides, but we actually, we'll say, I've got to think about this, or I've got to stand out of this for a bit, rather than getting sucked into one tribe or another. And I think that probably is our role. Now, I think there are some dangers in that. I mean, obviously, there are some situations where, as Christians, that we should stand for justice and righteousness and the right thing. But recognizing that sometimes when we do that, we might make a mistake. And I think that's the honest path, really, that actually by standing for righteousness, and it may be that Reagan was actually trying to make friends in Germany, you know, and by trying to make friends in Germany, he made enemies of Israel, you know, and therein lies the dilemma for all of us, that if if you make friends with, I don't know, a Trump supporter, that you might lose friends with a Democrat, you know. But somehow in the middle of that, we've got to find a way through that as Christians. And I think there is a purpose behind it. And I think what Paul, you alluded to, which is actually leading people to Christ, you know, it's actually showing them that there is, and what you said, Joe, which is really important, where your identity is, you know, that actually we're children of God, fundamentally, not Tories or Labour Party members or doctors or church leaders or black or white. We are something completely different.
It's good. I've just a few thoughts. I think that's a challenge for some Christians. I think given the lockdown, I'm just going to throw this out there. It's a generalisation, but there are Christians, and I've spoken with a few over the last few weeks, that when we're gathered and when we're together, they're covered, if you like. They're covered with, this is what we think corporately, generally. And if I'm in anywhere, I can ask a leader what I am supposed to think. I mean, they won't voice it like that. The challenge comes when we can't gather and we're locked down and we're on our own. And then I guess this is no disrespect to anybody, but we have to think for ourselves. And then that's when what we believe comes into play. Do we, do we know what we believe and why we believe it, and then being able to give a reason for that? And I think there are some people who are struggling with that. I think it's the same analogy is true of anything. You know, you get Trump supporters, you drill down into some deeper questions, and they're on very shallow ground because they're just repeating a narrative. And I think we have to be aware of that as church, that the people are not repeating a narrative, that actually it's alive in them, and we are investing ourselves in the Bible and Spirit and, you know, the disciplines and following Jesus. Otherwise, it just becomes a narrative that we can just spill out over social media, and it's something that we've heard, or something that we've heard corporately, or a leader has said, or we've heard in a preach, and that's all good. It's not negative, but it's if it lives within us more and more, then the grace of God will allow us then to have opportunity to share that in a peaceful way. That's for the long game, not the short fix. I mean, I've said a few things there, but I think, you know, there are, because you hear different people speak, and some are very, very fervent, but actually they haven't got a clue what they're talking about, or they're incorrect. I mean, I'm not just talking about church, I'm talking about a whole range of people. Some obviously are, some are very knowledgeable. But so I think that's a challenge. I mean, just on this completely separate thing, just about standing up. Many years ago, I think some of you heard this, when I worked in an office, and I was head of a large team, and we had a girl there who, she was basically a white witch, really. And at one lunchtime, she announced to everyone that she was going to do this live sort of tarot card reading for everybody in the office. Stood up and announced it to the office, and quite a few were interested. So I stood up and said, well, if she's going to do that, I'm going to stand over here and read my Bible aloud while she's doing it. Now, that was quite confrontational, but they all knew me, and I was partly some of their boss as well. But the main boss came in and said, no, neither of you are going to do any of that. You're not going to do anything. So I thought that was a win. Now, I didn't do it confrontationally, but I thought, no, I'm not having this. Now, we were friends, and I actually got talking to the girl afterwards, and we had a fantastic conversation, and we got on really well. She didn't convert, and I didn't have my cards read, but, you know. but we got on really well and we found common ground. But I thought there are times to stand. But I guess, yeah. Anyway, so I think it's with this crowd, this tribe mentality, we can speak the narrative and repeat things that we've heard, and other people do that. But when people drill down, if they turn around and start drilling down to the church and saying, okay, so what is it you really believe? What's happened? What's your story? We have got a story, and I think it's been confident enough in God to know what the Word says, to know how God works and what He's done and what He can do.
I think we're living in quite an interesting time because, the way that we're educated and the way that we're brought up, and it is that it is in a certain sort of rationalism that you think this because of this and this, and you look for the logic, and so with a lot of situations, we have, as the bedrock, if we're talking about situations outside the Bible, the bedrock of actually what is factual and what is true. And more over the last 5-6 years, we've seen that what is true is largely irrelevant. And so that kind of causes a significant disconnect, because if your plumb line is right, well, what's true? So actually, we've got this argument between that side and that side, and it's about a factual thing. Well, actually, you can do some research, you can investigate what that factual thing is, and as a result of that, well, you can come to the truth. And because you've got to the truth, you've therefore got to the answer. That particular standard is no longer always true, because as we've seen, somebody can be identified as being a liar or a serial liar, but yet still draws a huge amount of it draws a huge following and has a huge amount of credibility, even though the credibility is built on a lie. So therefore, the conversation then that you're having, you've got to somehow completely change what you're talking about, because the thing that you're drilling down to get common ground is no longer truth, and that creates a challenge. I don't think actually it means that we abandon truth. Clearly not. That the truth and the word is absolute. But it's trying to still use that anchor. I suppose it's an extra layer of disconnect that you've got to come over, rather than it just being about the facts. It's not only the facts, but it's the it's the thought process as well.
But we're also living in a world of relativism.
Yeah.
So, as Christians, we believe there's right and there's wrong, and there's an absolute truth.
Yeah.
And now, while that's still the worldview in other parts of the world, it's not the worldview in Europe.
Right.
So even though people will use, this is right, this is wrong about their tribe in terms of why their tribe is right. Like you say, if you drill that down, a fundamental belief that exists in our society is, well, everyone's entitled to their view. It's this kind of postmodernist, individualistic, relativistic thinking. And fundamentally, we have a different worldview as Christians. And I think there is always going to be that tension. Yeah. Because if you believe in a right and wrong because you believe in a God, then you're going to see some things very differently from somebody whose worldview is based on their experience and what they perceive to be right based on their beliefs and their experience of the world.
Yeah, I agree, Joe. And I think the challenge in that, of course, is that even Christians are disagreeing. about what is truth. And I think so. I think that the challenge that we face, I think, when we're dealing with that, is how we stand for truth when actually many Christians disagree about what is true and what isn't, in the same tribal way that actually what we're talking about in the world. I mean, you can talk about David Icke and his vaccinating, fear mongering, but actually that there is minutiae of this going on within the context of church life, and even probably amongst our friends in terms of how we deal with that. And I think I love the phrase in the Bible where it talks about, "For now I know in part, then I'll know in full." That's always helped me. And I think when I go into an argument where I'm standing for the truth, that will probably be one of my thought processes. Equally, there are some, and we talked about this over the years, there are some very solid truths which I'll never let go of, and ones that I'm not quite so sure about, or I'm less sure about. I'm sure about them, but I know that people argue about them. Yeah. But the ones I'm really sure about, I'm not going to let go of. And I think for us as Christians, back to your original point about identity and who we are, I think it's very, very important that we know what we're holding tight-fisted. So the tight-fisted bit, that Jesus died for sinners, rose from the dead for all men and women, or whatever it, for me, that, there are things that are 100% I'm never going to ever let go of. Yeah. And I think they're probably the most important things. And they're the things that as Christians that we do need to be sure about. Because otherwise what happens is that people will undermine some of the things you're holding less tightly. And eventually they'll make you feel a bit insecure about the ones that you're holding tightly. And I think that's really important. Equally, I think if you get most Christians in a room, we can probably find the things we agree about. And actually they are all the tight-fisted things. And I think probably when it comes to finding agreement, which was Dave's original comment in our discussion, how do we find agreement? I think it is that. I think it is finding what do we agree about? Shimon Peres and Ronald Reagan, what do we agree about? Rather than what we disagree about. Clearly we disagree about a lot of things, but what do we agree about? And I think maybe one of the solutions in our conversations with our neighbours, our friends, and even our internet friends, is where do we find agreement rather than where do we find disagreement? And I think that's quite important. But I agree with you, Joe, there is absolute truth. But the harbinger of absolute truth is God himself. And our interpretation of that absolute truth can be off beam, which is a challenge. So how do we get that truth? Well, we as Christians, we would talk about the Bible being a source of truth. But recognizing that we all read it slightly differently, I think that's important to understand that. I think as I've grown up, I pretty much believed everything my vicar told me, until I discovered that everything he told me wasn't always right. And then I discovered that there were some other church leaders, and I believed everything they told me. And then I've subsequently discovered that quite a few of the things that they told me wasn't right. And we've probably all of us gone around a few circles in our lives where we thought we believed something is true, and then actually, maybe it wasn't quite as true as I thought it was. But hopefully, certainly in my case, in the last 40 years of being a Christian, there are things now I'm more certain of now than I ever was at the beginning. But that would be one of the things I would say in terms of personally how you find truth. So finding things you agree about, a bit like Susie's comment about the unknown God. We can agree there's a God then. Let's start with that one. And we'll build from there. And I'll tell you my story, and then maybe that's one of the things that we can do. Personally, that's how I've always done it. I am known as a peacemaker, so and most of the time successful, not always though. And there's a humility that has come from failing to create peace in the last 2 or 3 years for me, where I've realized that actually I can't do it every time. I used to think I could do it always, but I've realized, having had a dismal failure in my work setting, that actually it can't always happen, and I have to accept that I'm wrong as well, which is, I think, is also a humility thing, isn't it? We've got about 5 minutes before we'll turn the stream off. Is there anything else you want to say?
I think probably adding on to that as well, it's great the points everyone's bringing, but the amount of times I've so needed to pray about something, or certainly someone that I don't take too easily, and just then having that compassion. I mean, I remember when I was, the couple of stories of when I was doing drama, and I used to be, there's one student who was incredibly confident and full of themselves, and I really didn't cope well with their confidence versus my hesitancy, until I noticed them once very, very vulnerable, because they had such a big part. They had to play for a play, and then I saw the other side of them, and it gave me some compassion to then realize, oh, that was a get-in for seeing that. And the amount of times I've needed to have compassion towards someone I've not really liked that much, or I've not found it easy to get on with them. And then I've had to pray for their situation or their opinions, or how do I relate to them. There's certainly, a person I don't know at the moment who is so glass half empty on everything that it's quite draining talking to them, but they need encouraging. They've not got an easy life. And I think even when you come across people whose opinions or the way of life they are is like, or even I sometimes feel on behalf of other people who, some people don't get them, and therefore they're quite unkind and judgmental. And it's like, but we're not walking in their shoes. If we walk in someone else's shoes, then we'll know what their life's like, and then cut them some slack, So
yeah, it's really helpful.
It's prayer and compassion, I guess. Certainly for what I've noticed of how I've been able to deal with certain types of people that I might want to deck, but you just got to pray for them, and ask. We need God. We need God.
Yeah.
Paul, you're going to say something, go on.
Just, a couple of things. I just reminded of the Apostle Paul before he met Jesus and what he was like. He was full of rage. He was anti-God, hated Christians, was killing them, imprisoning them. And then he had an encounter with Jesus, and it all changed. And the rage in him went. And I think, I see, you see it on the news, you see it around. There's a lot. I mean, the Bible talks about why did the nations rage? There's a lot of rage going on at the moment, and it's because people are lost. The Bible's clear that we're like sheep without a shepherd. We've lost. Each one has gone to his own way. And I think that's, there's a lot of rage and anger. And I think it comes, people are hurting, and they need us to bring healing. We have the answer, and it's not that we slap it in their face, but we have to take things on the chin. If they hate what we stand for, Jesus did that. I mean, if we're taking up our cross as he did, we could be crucified for it. But and some Christians have been and are. But I think it's standing in the gap for where people are hurting in order they can meet Jesus. And I'm not saying they're all going to have a road to Damascus experience, but as soon as they experience Christ, and they may be doing that in us, in the way we handle them with love and laying our lives down for them, that actually wins them over. And I think there are people hurting. The nations are hurting, and it's because they're lost, and they are without a shepherd, and there's an inherent call of eternity that cannot be answered without Jesus, and that's what's hurting, and it's coming out in different ways. And we are seeing that. We need to stand and be those people in the gap, even if we get hurt in the gap. We're standing in the gap for people, and that means that for me, it's asking Jesus to help me love people more and more, and be able to listen to them and to get an understanding of where they're at and who they are and where they're coming from, and hear their pain and say, you can have healing for that in Jesus.
So, Tony and Nikesh, I mean, you joined us quite late. I don't know whether you've watched any of the YouTube bit or beforehand, or you just joined us now. Anything you want to, maybe you can answer that, Tony. Have you been watching through, or you just joined us now?
No, sorry, I've just joined you now.
Okay, that's fine.
Face is not well.
That's fine. Okay. That's clarified. That's okay. And what about you, Nikesh? You just joined us now?
Yes, joined you now.
Okay, that's fine. So just I mean, just to summarize where we've been, I think in terms of our conversation, I think we've talked about the fact that the world is quite tribal. We've talked about the fact that we live in a world where effectively as Christians, we need to know our identity, that actually it's really important that there is a truth, and actually truth isn't relative. There is truth, and it's factual, and it's, you know, there is 100% truth. You know, there is always going to be truth. But as individuals, even as Christians, that our view of that truth isn't always as clear as it needs to be. That sometimes we have an angle on things that isn't quite right, and we have to be in a position where we admit sometimes that we've got it wrong. For now, we know in part, then we'll know in full. So there's a little bit of that in terms of our conversation. I think we've talked about the fact that actually it's important that we try and get on get into other people's skin, really, and understand their journey. And one of the things that we talked about this morning in terms of dissonance or cognitive dissonance is that actually people are very invested in their the place where they are, and actually, you know, but you know, people that hold a very strong opinion, that there's a lot of investment in that. And I share the fact that actually there was quite a lot of investment in me as an atheist before I became a Christian, like Paul just mentioned with the Apostle Paul, that actually it took me a month to tell my parents that I'd become a Christian, even though there was a lot of joy in that, because actually I'd invested quite a lot of arguments in finding some very strong ground. And I think we have to walk with people in that journey sometimes. So we've talked a couple of bits about that. We've talked about how we might get alongside people and walk with people, and we've also explored a few scriptures in that context as well. So we've been in James, and I've also shared about an example with Shimon Peres, who was president of Israel, and Ronald Reagan, where Ronald Reagan went to a SS cemetery in Germany, and obviously the people were trying to separate the two of them at the time, and Shimon says, well, a friend remains a friend, but a mistake remains a mistake, saying that actually he was still a friend of Reagan's, but the mistake he made was still a mistake. And actually one of the ways that we can be peacemakers is to recognize that people do make mistakes, but it doesn't stop them being friends. So I think that's and actually that's really important. So people can choose to be in a particular tribe, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we don't need to like them. And Paul Basson was sharing about a white witch in his office who he became friends with, but actually but equally it was very, very clear that what she was doing was wrong. You know, and I think that's really important, that we stand our ground. And then we also talked about that there are things that we hold very strongly and we will never let go of. And those are the things that actually somebody will never take out of my hand, you know. And I think that it's important as Christians that we do know what they are, recognizing that actually even with some of them, mostly not all of them, you might have, you know, you might personally be a little bit off as well. So we spent an hour talking about it. It is on YouTube, but I don't know whether Nikesh or Tony, you wanted to say anything particularly in line with, you know, how we're peacemakers in this world. How do we get alongside people? Whether you came on with a particular thing you wanted to share.
Yeah.
Tony, I'll start with you, and then Nikesh, if you want to say something.
Obviously, I find some of my ministry particularly challenging for many reasons, and I feel that God reminded me and continues to remind me, actually, how I saw the world before he became my light, you know, how I was actually blinded to, I wouldn't say totally mindless in my decisions, but how there was no light to make those decisions in. And therefore they were made in a way that just focused on survival and how I would continue to advance or move forward. And God reminds me that, you know, even now, after 21 years of kind of being under his lordship, his rule, and trying my best to sort of see within the light, and that light is him, that even now I still fail, and I'm still probably in some people's eyes one of them guys that often, using Susie's word, some people want to deck, because I'm a bit on in your face sometimes, and that is something that is part of me that I'm more and more aware of, and still have to use that. So when I think that way, and when I see things that way, it helps me recognize and actually allows me to raise other people up, not because of what they've done, but because of what they don't know, and yet they're still managing to connect and be as polite and carry on and stuff like that. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
So for me, that is one of the that's one of the things that allows me to continue to walk alongside people, and actually sometimes get a little glance at the soul and something of them that actually brings tears to my eyes, and I wish I could just just want to hug them and give them something, because I see the enemy at some lengths at work in that area. I guess it's what keeps me going.
Yeah, and I think you probably hit the nail on the head. Paul earlier mentioned that you could sum up the gospel very simply: love the Lord your God with all your heart, and love your neighbour as yourself, and love your enemies. I think there is an element, if you love somebody, genuinely love somebody, they can feel it. And actually that means that it ends up allowing you access to be friendly with people, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Nikesh, is there anything you wanted to say in the context of how do we resolve conflict? How do we were talking about the 4852 issues in the world, and some of the difficulties of that we find ourselves in. Is there anything you find that helps bridge the gap with people you disagree with?
Oh, good old-fashioned British diplomacy skills seems to help. Getting to know Zoe's family has been very helpful, because I've learned how the middle class do it, and they're very good at avoiding conflict. But that's not actually what I wanted to. What came to mind? The one thing that came to mind when I read the title of the thing was so it made me think of differences. I immediately, for some reason, thought difference of opinion in the church. I suppose I just assumed that there would be differences of opinion between different tribal groups, and some of those are irreconcilable unless you just come to have the same set of worldviews. But in the church, there should be, it's more, I think, poignant, because fundamentally there's no real excuse for having conflict. Essentially, you are brethren, you're brought together, and you're knit together by the one Spirit. And so what came to me was just Paul's exhortations, and I think that at the end of several of his letters, where he exhorts people, I think it's definitely at the end of Corinthians, but I may be wrong about that, but where he exhorts people to be of one mind and be united in one mind, he talks about. And for me, that's always a case of, and apologies if people have already said this in the meeting, but that's a case of being conformed to the mind of Christ. And it's not I don't think it's a sort of compromise. Okay, you kind of think that, I kind of think that, let's sort of meet in the middle. It's not really that, I don't think, because it may be a case that one person is just not in the right place and another person is. And so, but the way you kind of get to the good mind frame is by conforming, seeking out Christ, and as the members are seeking that out, they are converging to each other's mindset, because they're all converging to the same mindset, that plumb line.
Totally. I think we'd probably all agree that's that's true. I think so. So maybe we could just finish with how do we get the mind of Christ? Because that's what I preached on this morning. So how do you personally, individually, find you can do it? So I'll start with me. I find that the easiest way I find of doing it is obviously to pray and read the Bible, and to recognize that I need to be humble, and I think, and recognize that I'm only part of the way there. So I think if I think I've got all the answers, then I probably haven't. And actually, the reason I think that is because Jesus humbled himself, didn't he? And he became a servant of all. So so that's personally how I do it. I like to think, I don't know whether I do this or not, some of you have to tell me, I like to think that I can meet people at whatever level people are at, because I'm prepared to go lower. So I'm willing to go, I'm willing to get dirty and serve others. And I think probably that helps. So that's me. So I'm going to go around my screen. I'm going to go Dave and Susie, then Joe, then Paul, then Tony. You're Anthony on my screen, Anthony.
That's fine. It is my name after all.
Your mother's name. And then I'll end with Nikesh, and then we'll call it an evening. And you can watch it back, Nikesh and Tony, on the YouTube.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So Dave and Susie.
Yeah, I think two things. First of all, I'm trying to learn to listen more, because often you will hear of a situation and somebody will come to you with a situation, and you'll immediately go, yeah, we've been around the block here before, and I know this, and this, and this, and so the tendency is to try and jump in too early to fix things, and I'm trying to learn, first of all, to actually just bite my lip, or bite my tongue, and listen more and get a bit more of the information before launching in and trying to get both sides of the story. So a lot more listening needed. Secondly, is actually spend a bit more time listening to people that aren't of your, if you like, your normal social groups. In mine, sort of middle-aged, white, middle class. You're always going to get the same sort of opinion, but actually the more that you talk to different people, the more that you realize that there is a range of views out there. And actually, just because you've lived 50 plus years of life doesn't mean that you've been believing the right thing.
Susie.
Well, I think the point of issue, Steve, when you're saying you try to meet people where they're at, you've never come to Eurovision with us.
I disagree. I have come once.
Okay. Well, I mean, meeting people where they're at.
I came, I went, and left.
Didn't eat the pizza.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Anyway, moving on. I know that, certainly agreeing with all of you said, I know I often try, and I need to start the day with prayer, because I have to commit the day to God, because the amount of times, if something goes left field, there's times when I'm prepared for it because I've committed the day to God and the situations that might come my way, and that I need God's hand on whatever's coming.
Good.
And just knowing that I've started with God, to keep going with God through that day.
Very good.
And
Joe, sorry.
Just kind of to build on all of that, really, and just to say that I suppose to ask myself the question, before I start putting in a view or an opinion, where is this coming from? Is it coming from me, or is this coming from, from the Bible, from my Christian faith? So yeah, I suppose it's linking to what Dave says about stopping and thinking, but yeah, I'm not saying that I'm there. Yeah, learning.
Very good. Thank you. Paul.
Okay. Well, I think for me, having the mind of Christ really is talking about the indwelling of the Spirit, and renewing your mind. So it's renewing your mind. So it's asking questions. So I tend to question everything. That's more difficult when you're questioning yourself, but I have other people that do that very well. But I think it's asking the Spirit to show you, because the Holy Spirit is there to lead us into all truth, and if He leads us into all truth, He can use us to help lead other people into truth. But I think we do, the Bible says that if we're believers and we're indwelt with the Spirit, we will have the mind of Christ. But that's a long-term journey thing. It's not an instant full download of a complete program. It's little downloads, isn't it? And you build on that, as Joe was saying. And so I think simply it's far more involved to explain it in 1 minute or 2 sentences, but essentially it's that.
Sure. Tony?
Yeah, I generally agree with what I've heard. I think I'm always constantly really trying to recognize that there's nothing I do that doesn't have my interest at heart. Very self-centered, concerned, and that's good deeds and everything. And with that challenge there, I think it allows me to really want to go beyond that, the acts and things, and kind of say, God, this is something I really recognize. So it's more about you in this. So I can listen to the word, I can read the word, I go and apply the word, but the root of what's happening in that process can still be selfish and me and everything else, and not Jesus. That's the kind of way I mean it. And with that being kind of pressing against my decision making, then I realize, I think as Paul's just pointed out, that really we need the Spirit to kind of guide us and show us more about what we should and shouldn't be doing, and who we should and shouldn't be doing it with, if that's a simple way of putting it. And also it allows me to, when I'm reading the scripture, not just to think that it's all about me, because I can be very much like that as I'm reading it, that actually God's speaking about us all, about the body, and about the importance of that iron sharpening iron, that process of opening up and sharing, and and being honest.
Yeah.
Really. And I think that's all part of that ascertaining and grasping for the mind of Christ.
Thank you. Nikesh?
To be honest, I don't think there's anything I can do to renew my mind, and that's part of the work of the cross and His resurrection, and it's Him that does it in me, Christ in me, the hope, glory, and it's Him that renews my mind by the indwelling Spirit, as Paul mentioned. My part in this probably could be, is in as much as being not resisting what the Lord is doing, not letting the flesh, that Romans 7 that you were reading out today, not giving the flesh leeway, and being obedient to His call.
Yeah,
that's about it, really.
Thank you. Well, I'm gonna call it an end, because we've spent a good hour and a quarter having a chat about this. It's been really helpful. It's helped me. I hope that when some people watch back, it will help them as well. I just want to thank you for being honest and open. It's not as always easy to do that in a group like this online than it is in a room, but it's a way of doing things. And I'm going to finish by praying, I think, because I think we would benefit from being blessed this evening. Lord, I want to thank you for every contribution this evening. I want to pray for peace in every room, in every house, and in every mind. And that, Lord, that as we've prayed today, Lord, the Holy Spirit, we pray that we would have the mind of Christ. I thank you that you want to do that in us, Lord. You want to change us. You want to change our thinking. And Lord, I pray that we would be known as peacemakers. wherever we are, that we will be known as children of God because of the peacemaking we do. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.